When me and my troublemaking friends were 13 years old, one of the many rowdy and mischievous things we would do would be Saturday night ding-dong ditch sessions. 10 years ago, we all lived on the same block in a typical suburban neighborhood. At the time, there were a lot fewer houses and more woods, though. I'm going to make up names for my friends for the case of this story. There was Mark, James, and Matt. Either Mark or James were usually the ones to go up to the houses and ring the bells. Matt and I, on the other hand, would usually find hiding spots right away. We hit about 5 or 6 houses. I remember all the men who answered the doors gave pretty much the same reactions. They stepped out onto the stoop. 1 or 2 would yell something, and then they'd walk back inside. For a couple of houses, we rang the bell again for a better reaction. One guy yelled he was calling the cops the second time, so when he shut his door, we all booked it down the street and went to the next block over. As I mentioned, 10 years ago in this neighborhood, there were patches of woods sitting where houses stood today. On the next block over, there were a few patches of woods surrounding some of the houses, and the houses on this block seemed to be more unkempt. The first house on the block was across the street from the patch of woods, which made for a perfect hiding spot. The house was kind of run down looking. Tall grass, a ratty old car with a cover on it in the driveway, and overall, just a small house. Mark went up to ring the bell. He barely had time to make it across the street before the door opened. It was another man to answer the door. This guy was really big, about 6 feet in stocky build. Unlike the others, he was furious immediately. He walked around his whole front yard, checking the bushes, yelling threats. We all laughed, as we always did. Eventually, he finally went back inside. Mark waited a few minutes, checked the windows, and then ran back up the stoop to ring the bell again. I didn't envy him with this house. I would not be bold enough to ring that man's bell again. Mark knew he probably didn't have as much time, so he ran to the side of the house and out of sight. The door opened much quicker this time, and this time, the man came out with a rifle in his hand. We all looked at each other simultaneously going, "Uras under arrest?" The man checked all the places he checked before, and then a few extra places this time, like behind his car, behind a couple of trees. And then he walked to the center of his lawn and just stood there, as if he were thinking. He looked around, and then his head stopped as he was facing us in the woods. Me, Matt, and James looked at each other. We ducked lower in hopes that he didn't see us. After 10 seconds of staring in our direction, the man went back into his home, and then we saw him appear at his front window, standing still like a statue, looking in our direction in the woods once again. He saw Mark creeping back over to the man's front door, but there was nothing we could do. We were too afraid to move or yell anything. Mark rang the bell once again and ran for it. The man didn't move, though, at least not for another minute. Then he turned and walked away from the window. We didn't see Mark again, but we were still too nervous to move or say anything. The next thing I remember, we heard Mark's voice from across the street yelling, "Run!" We didn't understand until we heard someone running up from behind us, realizing upon turning our heads that it was the man from across the street with his rifle in hand, pointed at us. We ran like little prey from a predator to Mark, who was waiting for us across the street. We ran for blocks until we were sure we lost him. Mark explained that he yelled when he saw the man sneaking across the street into the patch of woods with his gun. We didn't report him or any of what happened. We just told a few friends, and that was it. Luckily, the house was many blocks from us. I've owned and lived in the same house for 8 years. It's a normal family-sized home, which was relevant when I had roommates. But when they moved out and it just became me living here, I had nothing to do with the extra space. It was technically a 4-bedroom house, but I only used 2 of the bedrooms. One is my main bedroom and one is the game room. The other 2 rooms were on the far end of the upstairs hallway. One had a few storage boxes in it, and the other was completely empty. After getting out of work at 9 o'clock, I picked up Wendy's on the way home and pretty much went right to the game room. I was off tomorrow, so what better to do than game all night? I put my headphones on and loaded up code, but before I had time to even load into a match, I thought I heard something that sounded like a knock at the front door. I took my headset off and listened, but not hearing anything and figuring they would have knocked again if there was someone there, I went back to my game. Probably a whole 2 hours went by, and then I heard it again. It sounded like either a knock or a door closing or something like that. But with my headphones on and with my room door closed, it was way too quiet for me to tell. I got up and opened the door, looking out into the hallway and waiting for that sound to come again. After a minute, though, I went downstairs and looked out the front door. Nobody was outside my house, and everything seemed normal. Having been hearing these sounds, though, I obviously made sure the door was locked before going back upstairs. To be a bit more cautious, I left my room door open this time, so if it happened again, maybe I'd hear it better. I put my headset back on and continued gaming. I played through a whole round, so like 20-ish minutes. As the game ended and I leaned back in my chair, a figure rushed past the open doorway, just off to the side of my view. I immediately threw my headphones off and jumped from my chair. Horrified and unsure what to do, I just stared at the doorway. I didn't get the courage to finally move for several minutes. When I looked into the hallway, though, and eventually the rest of the house, nobody was there, but the front door was unlocked again. When police came and investigated, it was clear that the person had been hiding and very likely living in the empty room. I hadn't been in there for weeks or maybe even months, so all this time, they could have been just on the other side of the wall from me, and I had no idea. It's really scary to think about, especially if I'd happened to confront him. There's no saying what he would have done. This happened to me just a bit over a year ago. I'm 24 and have a townhouse in the suburbs. I live alone, which for me gets really boring, so I try to have friends over whenever I can. My closest friends come a couple of times a week and sometimes even sleep over to escape their parents' houses. I didn't have any plans this night, but I had plans for the next day with my friend Sarah, who was supposed to be coming over to have a movie night. So I really was just trying to get this night over with and looking forward to the next day. I went to bed early, like 9:15. In the middle of the night, I woke up. I looked at my nightstand and saw it was 2 a.m. But the way I woke up was odd. My heart was pounding for some reason, and my brain was very alert and aware like something was happening. I thought maybe I had just woken up from a nightmare or something until I heard a click from downstairs. I sat up. A door slowly screeched open, and I could hear someone's footsteps entering my home. Although terrified, I thought this had to be Sarah or one of my other friends, as they all had keys to my house in case they needed somewhere to stay. I got up from my bed and walked over to the door, opening it and stepping into the hallway. "Sarah?" No one responded. I waited in the hallway for what felt like forever, but then a bright light suddenly flickered on, lighting up the whole downstairs. A second later, a soft chattering noise came from the living room. Whoever it was had turned on the TV. For a moment, I felt relief, thinking it was definitely one of my friends who had one too many drinks. I went down the stairs and into the living room and felt my whole body turn ice cold in an instant. Some random man was sitting on my couch looking at the TV screen. He looked maybe 50 years old with patchy, long black hair and dirty clothes. As I stared at him in fear, he glanced over at me and showed a crooked smile, then waved his hand as if to invite me over to the couch. I turned around and sprinted right out the front door. I banged on my neighbor's door until they let me in and called the police. By the time they made it, though, he was gone. No trace of him at all. What's worse is the police didn't take it all that seriously, suggesting it was probably just some harmless homeless man wanting a place to sleep. The way I see it, everything points to otherwise. He picked the lock on my door, sat on my couch, and turned on the TV. Then the sick man smiled at me and invited me over to the couch. I think he may have been a stalker or something, and now I find it hard to even sleep at night when I'm alone, thinking that there's a chance that I'm not really alone. My friend Derek and I rent a house together. He's a pretty big partier, though, and often stays out really late or even sleeps over at others' places, so a lot of nights I have to myself. This was one of those nights where Derek was out at the club or something, so having the night alone, I brought out a couple cans of beer to our front porch and sat on the swinging bench we had set up. It was nice weather out, and with it being nearly midnight, most people were sleeping, and the neighborhood was pretty quiet. After being out for a little less than an hour, a person came walking down the street in front of the houses. He looked like a large guy and had a sweatshirt on with a hood over his head. But something was off about the way he was walking. He was very stiff, like only his legs were moving, and his whole upper half wasn't. When he got up to the part of the road my house was in front of, he stopped and looked over at me. I waited a few seconds for him to say something, but he didn't say anything. He just stood there in the middle of the road right in front of my house and looked at me. "Hey, buddy, you need something?" He stayed quiet for a moment, then started walking up my driveway. I stood up from the bench and yelled at him to leave, but once I realized he was getting pretty close, I hurried inside and locked the door behind me. I then watched out the peephole as the guy came right up to the door. He waited for another second before pulling out something from under his sweatshirt. It was hard to see from the small view I had, but it looked like maybe a hammer or crowbar or something. Once I saw that, I knew what was likely about to happen. I ran upstairs and locked myself in the bedroom, dialing 911 and trying to be quiet. I could hear the wood splintering off the door downstairs as I pleaded with the operator for help. Then there was a loud thud and silence. The broken door swaying on its hinges was the only sound. I waited anxiously, only assuming that I'd hear the guy's footsteps approaching the bedroom door at any second. But seconds turned to minutes until I heard a cop car pull into my driveway. I thought about running down to the officers, but the operator suddenly told me through the phone to stay where I was and wait for the cops to get to me, so I sat back down. 30 seconds later, I heard one of the officers walking up the stairs, followed by them shouting and firing off a taser. The guy had been standing right outside the bedroom door, as if he was just waiting for me to open it. He was arrested and apparently was very drunk, but I have no clue who he was or why he did what he did. As far as the officers have told me, the guy wouldn't even say why he was walking down the road or what he was even doing there. All I know is if I had opened that door, it would have been the last thing I ever did. I lived in a house from hell for a couple of weeks. I was a college student, and my parents were paying for a house for me to live in. Unspoiled, I know. Well, the house was modest, nothing fancy or huge, and I was happy with it. Well, for the first few days anyway. Then things quickly started getting strange. On a rainy Saturday with nothing to do, I was watching TV for a few hours. That was when I heard a scrape on my living room floor. I looked around the room, thinking an animal got into the house or something. I sat back down and resumed watching TV. That was the first weird occurrence. The rain continued throughout the rest of the day and into the night, which made for an excuse to not go out. I stayed in watching more TV in the living room. I perked up when I felt I heard something from the kitchen. Laughably, I took a pillow with me as, I guess, some sort of weapon, and walked over to the kitchen doorway. There in the middle of the dark kitchen was a box of Cheerios on the floor, spilling out hundreds of the tiny O's. I had no idea how that could have happened. Nevertheless, I dropped the pillow and began cleaning up the Cheerios off the floor. As I was doing so, I heard a creak, like the sound weak areas of a wood floor make when someone steps on them. It was by the kitchen table. I looked up, but nobody was there. I knew I was going crazy now. Every little sound must have been making me paranoid. I cleaned the Cheerios and went back to watching TV. The thunder outside was getting louder as the bulk of the storm seemed to be passing overhead. Yet I found it to be strangely relaxing. That was the last thing I remember, appreciating the sound of the storm outside before waking up from what seemed to be an hour-long doze. The TV was still on, but that wasn't what woke me. I remember believing I woke up to a bang or a thud from downstairs. Regardless, I turned off the TV and marched upstairs to bed. The next day was normal, as was the day after that. It wasn't until the next gray, rainy day that strange things started happening again. I woke up in my bed that morning feeling like I had been drinking all night the night before. I felt sicker than I'd ever felt with any hangover before. I didn't do much walking around that day. The gloomy, dark weather only made me more bedridden. I left the TV in my bedroom on all day just as background noise, with a garbage pail by my side in case I had to puke. At midday, I muted the TV after hearing sounds coming from above me. The attic. The attic door was actually in my bedroom, and most of the attic was built over that bedroom. It wasn't just once that I heard it. It was 3 or 4 times. I managed to get out of bed despite the fact that every time I moved, I wanted to puke. I pulled the string of the attic door down, took one of my old baseball bats with me, and climbed up the steps. I pulled the light switch down to light up the attic. There were a few old boxes that must have belonged to the previous owner, scattered about, but I couldn't see any living things to produce those noises. I climbed back down quickly because I was kind of scared of that attic. There were no more noises until that night. I woke up to, at first, what I thought was thunder. Still feeling a bit sick, the familiar sound of a thud from up in the attic gave me chills. I pulled the string to the attic door back down, took my baseball bat once again, and climbed up the stairs. I made myself angry and screamed in the most intimidating voice I could. But before I could turn the light on, I heard the sound of a child giggling in the pitch-black attic. Words cannot describe the feeling of weightlessness, the feeling of my insides dropping inside of my body, the fear that I felt. The word fear is not enough to describe what I felt at that moment. I was out of that house so fast I don't even remember running. I called my dad in the cold rain and asked him to pick me up. I explained everything the best I could. My parents saw how emotional I was about this, and in a weird sense, I think they believed me. I packed all of my things up with my parents the next day and moved back home. To this day, I'm convinced what I experienced in that house was completely paranormal. I used to work as a maid for some old lady for a couple of weeks when I was 20. She had a really big yet old house on a property that could have been beautiful if she had actually taken care of it. She had 2 acres of land surrounded by woods in 3 directions and the road on the other. The house itself was ancient, mostly made of wood, and the interior was really dark. She would often keep the blinds shut in some rooms for reasons I didn't understand. I would sometimes open the blinds to let some sunlight in, only to find that she had shut them by the next time I entered the room. She lit some rooms by candle, which made the house seem even more prehistoric for me inside. To top it off, the wood floors were a creaky ecologist about everywhere in the house. The woman's name was Mel. She was around 70 years old. The kind of work Mel would have me do would be mostly physical stuff that she couldn't do very well anymore, like sweeping, dusting, cleaning dishes, doing laundry, sorting mail, and other things of that sort. One weekend, Mel asked me to sleep there for a night or 2. The house had like 4 bedrooms, yet she lived alone, so it wasn't an issue. Well, this takes place over the course of a Friday and technically a Saturday as well. I arrived as per usual on Friday. Speaking very few words to Mel, I dropped my backpack full of my clothes and cosmetics onto the bed in the bedroom that I was going to be sleeping in. As I turned to the door, I saw Mel standing by the doorway. She had a creepy way about her, and this entrance was no exception. She didn't say hello, which wasn't as weird as it sounds. She just instructed me to clean the bedroom right away. After that, she just told me to simply straighten up the whole house, and then she went upstairs. I didn't see her for the rest of the day, but I would occasionally hear her walking around upstairs in her bedroom. It was weird. She would seem to walk back and forth. There were no TVs in this house, so I didn't know what she could have been doing. One thing that I found bizarre was how protective she was of her basement. She made it clear it was completely off limits, and she didn't want me going down there. Nighttime came and I went to bed early. This was before smartphones were a thing, so I didn't even know what time it was. It was probably 9 or 10 o'clock though. For the first few hours, everything was peaceful. However, I still had trouble falling asleep, given that it was the most uncomfortable bed I'd ever been in. It felt like hours later that I started hearing footsteps outside my room on the creaky floors. It sounded like Mel was passing my room really slowly. Maybe she was just going to the bathroom. A few minutes later, I heard her footsteps again, but then she stopped outside my door. This time I sat up and listened. I could hear the creaking from behind the door of Mel standing there, and it was starting to creep me out. She finally walked away. I heard her go down the stairs, and then I heard a door open and close from downstairs. I had a feeling it was the basement door. It was a while later that I heard the door open and close again, and then heavy, slow footsteps coming up the creaky stairs. The footsteps once again came to my door, then stopped. I sat up once again to listen, and I could hear creaks of pressure on the floor outside the door. And then I heard the doorknob start to turn. I laid back down and pulled the sheets over me and pretended to be asleep. I heard Mel take a few steps into the room, pause, and then leave. She went back to her room and shut the door. I was a bit disturbed. This was very bizarre behavior. I waited about half an hour before deciding I had to see what was in that basement. I got out of the rickety bed, tiptoed to the door, and then tiptoed down the stairs the best I could. I opened the heavy basement door, flipped on the lights, and crept down the stairs. I made it to the bottom step and held in the urge to scream. There were two old wooden chairs dead center in the basement, and there were two of what I could only describe as decaying corpses with wigs on them sitting in them. The sight of a bug crawling on one of them made me want to puke even more. I brought myself to walk deeper into the basement, closer to the corpses. I had to make sure they were real. Both of the corpses had men's wigs on them. The bigger of the two also had a beret on. I don't know much about corpses or their rate of decaying, but I'd say these corpses were both almost a year old. I felt like my heart stopped momentarily when I heard footsteps coming from upstairs on the first floor. I couldn't make it to the light switch. I had no time. I hid behind one of the couches in the basement as I heard slow, heavy footsteps coming down, one creepy stair at a time. I had my hands covering my mouth as I heard Mel reach the last stair. I heard her whisper my name. For half a second, I looked around the couch and saw Mel halfway across the basement, already with a big kitchen knife in her hand. I knew she would be too slow to catch me, so I ran for it to the stairs. She screamed my name and followed as fast as she could. When I made it to the first floor of the house, I ran upstairs to the bedroom I was sleeping in to grab my backpack. By the time I ran back downstairs, Mel was at the top basement step. I ran out the front door into my car. I turned it on, caught my breath, looked to the front door of the big old house, and saw Mel standing there. I drove off the huge property and down the road, making it back home within 10 minutes. Fortunately, I never gave Mel any of my information, such as my address or my phone number, so she was never able to contact me again. If I had to guess, I'd say one of those corpses belonged to her dead husband that she'd mentioned twice to me. As for the other smaller corpse, I have no idea. But regardless, it was a disturbing scene to witness, and something was way off about that woman. I signed up for DoorDash just to see if it was as good as they advertised. Initially, though, it took me a whole month to finally get myself to take on my first delivery. But from then on, I did a couple of deliveries a day and was really happy with the results. A couple of months after that, I quit my grocery job and started dashing every day after school, and even on most weekends. On this night, I was working extra late because it was a holiday weekend. I was driving from 8 p.m. until 2 a.m., pretty much just going back and forth from the 24/7 McDonald's. A little past 2, I picked up another McDonald's order and went en route to the customer. It was set to be delivered at some sort of warehouse, and in the notes it said to go in through the side doors and drop it off at the front desk. When I got there, I pulled into this huge parking lot. It was mostly empty, only having a few semi-trucks in it. The building was definitely an old warehouse, though, being just a large rectangle with a few windows and a single door at the front. I checked one more time to make sure I had it right to deliver it through the side door, then pulled around to the side and parked. The side door was one of those really heavy metal doors with a small glass window. I looked through that tiny window and didn't see anything but a small and dark entrance room. But the glare from my car's headlights made the window reflective and hard to see through. I swung it open and was immediately taken aback. It was just as dark as it seemed through the window, and it only had a tiny wall light in the corner that was more of a dim safety light. There was no front desk, so I walked around the corner and stood at the end of a long, unlit corridor. I knew that most places that have night shift workers don't keep on the unnecessary lights, but this seemed excessive. I couldn't even see the end of the hallway, so if I were to walk down there, I would be walking into complete darkness. I took my phone out and checked now for a third time to see if I'd gone to the wrong place or through the wrong door. Everything seemed right, but there wasn't any way I was going to walk through that hallway. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized how quiet the whole building was. No machinery moving or people talking, not a sound at all. I decided to call the customer. I clicked on their name and had to dial the number. And just a moment later, I heard a phone ring echo from the other end of the hallway. After another few seconds, it rang again, but it was closer and louder this time. I stared into this empty corridor and could barely make out the faint glow of someone's phone. "Hey, I got an order here from DoorDash. I'm gonna leave it right here for you," I said, setting the bag down in front of me. The figure of a large man started to come out of the dark corridor, but they didn't say anything. I waited another second. But as they got closer, it just really seemed unnerving, the way they were walking so fast and not speaking. I had this feeling like someone was going to jump out behind me or something, and overall was a little freaked out. I turned around and walked quickly out of the door and back to my car. A few moments later, I saw some movement from behind the small glass window on the door just before I pulled away. That whole thing gave me chills and had me call it a night and go straight home. In the end, I chose to believe it was just a weird situation all around. But nothing really happened, so I blew it off. A couple of days would go by, and on Monday evening, while I was driving again, I got a strange call. It was from the police department. What happened next was more complicated than it had to be, but basically they questioned me about why I was at that specific warehouse at 2:30 a.m. on Saturday morning. Apparently they had security footage of my car pulling up. After explaining I was just a DoorDash driver and I proved it with the delivery receipt, they told me what was going on. They said that the workers came back from their holiday weekend, where the warehouse was not in operation, and found a DoorDash delivery sitting in the middle of the hallway. Whoever was there had broken in and ordered with a fake account, which is all scary in its own right. But the creepiest part is that they didn't even take the bag of food. It's pretty obvious that they were looking for something else. I don't know what they wanted from me, but I can only assume that if I had stayed and waited for the man, something terrible would have happened. When this happened, I was 23 and worked full-time at a pizza shop in my local area. I'm not sure if things were going on before this, but as far as I know, everything started and ended on this one night. Me and my best friend Tim worked the night shifts at this pizza place. It was a real small shop, having just 3 or 4 tables inside because we specialized in delivery and takeout. Both me and Tim got our jobs there while we were in college, but just never left. Being in a quiet rural town too, the job wasn't too much work. Never had busy days. Really just a steady flow of orders sometimes. On this night, there was a light storm outside, and in return, business was slow. There were a few orders here and there, but overall, we didn't have much to do. By 10 p.m., Tim suggested we start cleaning up the place and maybe even clock out 15 minutes early. I went with it, grabbing some rags to wipe the tables with when the phone at the front desk rang. I picked up after a few rings. "How can we help you today? Hello?" I waited another 5 seconds before putting the phone down and shaking my head. Just some prank call, I thought. I went back to scrubbing the tables, but at the front of the store, I saw a glare coming from the window. There was a car parked a few spots back. I couldn't see too well through the window in the rain, but there was definitely a light on in the car, like a cell phone or something. The pizza shop was on an individual lot. There were no other cars, so that was the only reason I noticed them. A moment later, the phone rang again. Tim was closer, so he picked up this time. I could hear someone's muffled voice coming from the phone, and after a short talk, Tim hung up. At the same time, the light in the car turned off, and they drove away. I told Tim what I saw and how it was a little weird, but he shrugged and said it was just some old man who was ordering a pizza for delivery. I looked back at the now empty parking lot. It wouldn't make much sense for someone to order a pizza for delivery from right outside the shop, so I figured Tim was right, and it was nothing. He started making the pizza while I continued cleaning. 10 minutes later, Tim boxed it up and handed it off to me to deliver. I ran through the rain to my car, then pulled up the address on my phone. 11 minutes away, not too bad. I pulled out and started making my way there. The roads were dead, nobody out at all. Google Maps took me down to a neighborhood full of large homes, then had me turn down a long driveway that led to a cul-de-sac where there were 3 more driveways, each leading to a different house. I went down the one Maps told me to and pulled up next to the home. It was one of those large, expensive houses, but pretty old looking and not very modern at all. I parked the car and double-checked the address with the house number, then picked up the pizza and ran up to the front door. Pizza delivery! I took a step back and looked at the front of the house. All of the lights were off. I dialed Tim's cell and had him call the guy who ordered. My phone buzzed a moment later, and Tim told me that his call went straight to voicemail. I shook my head in frustration and ran back through the rain to my car and got in. I tossed the pizza on the passenger seat and started backing out. This wasn't out of the ordinary, getting fake orders or dead deliveries, but it still annoyed me every time. When I got back, Tim was cleaning and said there were no more orders, so we were good to finish up and head out. I tossed the pizza in the trash and started helping him. Both of us were in the back cleaning the ovens and wiping the prep counters when a sudden bang came from the front of the building. We looked at each other, then ran to the front. At first, we didn't see anything, but then Tim spotted a small crack on the door. I walked over and opened it, and right outside was a heavy rock, big enough to throw and do some damage with. I looked around, seeing the parking lot was completely empty and nobody was nearby. Both of us were really confused and kind of freaked out. We talked about maybe calling the cops, but neither of us wanted to deal with that right now. To put things in perspective, it was 10 minutes before we were off, and if we called, then we'd be here for another hour at least. The crack on the door wasn't too big, not really that noticeable, so we chose to wait and just tell our manager the next day instead. We quickly finished up with the cleaning and left through the back door where our cars were parked. On the drive home, I rethought all the strange things that happened, and it made me uneasy. I pulled into my driveway and walked inside. It was late, so I knew I had to get in bed soon, but I wanted something to snack on first. I went to the kitchen to see what I had, but before I even opened the pantry, I heard a car splash through the puddles on the street outside my house. From the sound of it, I could tell it was parking. I walked over to my window and peeked outside, seeing a car parked right in front of my driveway. It only took me a second to realize it was the same car I'd seen outside the pizza shop. A cold rush went through me, and I stayed in the window to see what they were doing. The car was still on, but I couldn't see through their window. After a minute of no movement, I took out my phone and called Tim, telling him that I think one of the customers followed me home and was parked right outside my house.
Are you serious? You need to call the cops.
Something's not right, he said, urging me to hang up and call the police immediately. I don't know why I was so nervous to call the cops, but hearing Tim say it made me feel better about it. I moved away from the window and dialed 911. The lady on the line said that they would have someone on their way and that I should stay hidden and wait. I heard a car door open and close, so I quickly said okay and hung up. Looking back out the window, a man was walking up my driveway. He was wearing dark clothes covering his whole body and a hood covering his face. As he approached the house, I closed the curtains by the window and waited. Footsteps came to the front door. Then they continued across the front of the house until they reached the outside of the window and stopped. The sudden silence made the sound of the rain increasingly louder. I felt like I was standing there quietly for minutes before I stepped forward and moved the curtain an inch to the side, just enough to peek through. The man's cold eyes stared back at me. I let go of the curtain, and the man banged on the window. I stood a few feet away, terrified to death, and just as quickly as it started, it ended. There was no more banging, no footsteps, nothing. All that was left was the sound of the raindrops clicking against the window. Although I never heard the man leave, he was gone when the police showed up. No car or man in sight. I told them all that had happened from the middle of my shift to the end of the night. They looked at me like I was crazy, and part of me felt crazy too. None of it made any sense, and there didn't seem to be any motive for the man to have done what he did. Honestly, because of that, the whole night had me messed up for a while. Going through something as senseless as that really just stayed with my head. I'm hoping that by sharing this, someone may be able to help me understand what happened or why the man did what he did. It sounds odd, but even now, when it gets really quiet on rainy days, there's an eerie feeling that rushes through me, bringing me back to that night. When I was in high school, I did deliveries for my parents' restaurant. I had just turned 16 and gotten my driver's license, and my parents had always wanted to start offering delivery. I didn't want to be a waiter or work at the register, so driving sounded like a good option. When this happened, I had been doing deliveries for a few months, so I was pretty comfortable with it. It was a Thursday around 8 p.m., and my dad gave me an order to deliver. I got in my car, which was actually my mom's SUV, then started the drive. Google Maps said the house was 25 minutes away. Our town was small, so 25 minutes away was actually pretty far. As I drove, I started to recognize the area as being on the edge of town, and I still had 10 minutes to go. I'd never been this far out in this direction before, so I was definitely paying attention and keeping my eyes open. I wasn't scared per se, but just felt uncomfortable. The only houses I was passing now were farmhouses far from the main road. When the directions told me to turn, it was down a long, unpaved path going straight to one of these farmhouses. Now I was starting to get a little freaked. A farmhouse this far out at night was probably the last place I wanted to be. But I knew I was probably just spooking myself, and it was just a simple delivery. I drove down to the end of the path, which ended and just became a small grass field in front of the house. It wasn't clear whether or not to drive on the grass, so I just parked the car there and got out. It was eerily quiet. All I could hear were my footsteps on the grass as I walked up to the house. The porch light was on, but no other lights were on inside the house. I was looking over my shoulders constantly and walked quickly. The longer I was out there, the more uncomfortable I was. Just before I reached the porch, I heard something. It sounded like it was coming from the backyard behind the farmhouse, but it was loud, like a wooden door opening. I stepped onto the porch and dropped the bag on the doorstep, then rang the doorbell and started rushing back to the car. I was regretting how far I parked and wished I had just driven on the grass. As I listened to the only sound of my footsteps under me, I started to hear more footsteps running behind me in my direction. I turned around and saw 3 men sprinting at me through the grass. I tried to run back to my car, but in seconds I was tackled to the ground. One of them held me down while another started taking everything from my pockets. I was yelling and screaming for help, but I knew nobody could hear me. It all happened really fast, and once they looted my pockets, one of the men kicked me in the stomach, and they all ran and got in the car, turning around and driving away. I got up and just watched the headlights disappear on the long, empty road. I had no phone and no way to get back. I didn't know what else to do, but just start walking toward the road. When I reached the road, I started walking down the way I came. I had no way of telling time, but I think I was walking for 30 to 40 minutes before a patrol car pulled up in front of me. My parents had called for them to check on me because I wasn't responding. To sum it up, the cops found a small barn behind the farmhouse with another restaurant delivery bag inside it. They think they tried to do the same thing to someone before me, but probably missed their chance or chickened out for some reason because there were no other reports. The actual owners of the farmhouse were out of town, so they had no involvement. My phone was able to be tracked though, and was found thrown in a field off the side of the road not too far away. The stolen car, however, took 3 weeks to be located. It was found nearly 400 miles away and had been almost entirely emptied. This was almost a year ago now, and those 3 men that attacked me still have yet to be identified. I worked as a security guard at a large hotel in Las Vegas during my late 20s. It paid way better than pretty much any other job nearby that I was actually qualified for. But the most annoying part about it was the scheduling and the staff. At the time, the building was having trouble with a lack of staff to cover shifts, so my schedule would be mornings, evenings, or overnights, all randomly throughout the week. It made it really hard to even sleep sometimes. But again, I liked the money. Anyways, I was working a late evening shift this night and was at the front desk talking to 2 of my coworkers. It was around 11 and my shift ended at 12, so we were just passing the time. In the middle of our conversation, the phone rang on the desk that I was leaning on. Checking the number, it was from one of the rooms in the hotel, so I picked it up and asked how I could help them. A man spoke saying that there was something going on in one of the rooms down the hall and that he was really worried about it. I asked him what he meant, and he frantically responded, telling me to come up quick because he was getting really nervous. I checked the room number on the phone, then told him I would send security up as soon as possible. Of course, though, I was just referring to myself. When I put the phone down, I quickly explained the strange nature of the call to my coworkers, then headed to the elevators and went to the mid-level floor where the caller's room was located. Walking down the hallway, there was a strange sense of absolute silence. I expected to hear whatever the caller was talking about, but there were no loud noises coming from anywhere on the floor. I also kind of expected the caller to have been standing by their door waiting for me or something, but the door was closed. I knocked on the door loudly, announcing that it was hotel security. I didn't hear any movement or sounds coming from the room at all, and after a minute of no answer, I walked down to the end of the hallway, listening intently for anything unusual, then continued back to the door, knocking again. A few moments later, though, the room behind me opened their door, and an older woman asked if I was security. I said yes and asked if they knew anything about a strange noise or the caller from the room, to which they replied that they had heard loud noises traveling through the hallway a few minutes ago, but were unsure what it was. From their voice and facial expressions, they seemed really terrified. At this point, I was already starting to get really nervous, but things only got stranger. I grabbed my walkie and radioed down to the front desk, asking them to call the room again and let me know if they answered. After a little bit, they replied that nobody answered. I stood there for a moment, trying to think of what to do before radioing back down to them. I told them to check who was staying in the room. After waiting for what felt like forever, they finally got back to me, saying that nobody had the room booked for tonight. Even more confused, I took out my security key card and opened the door, since nobody was supposed to be there. The room looked clean and unused as far as I could tell. I searched every corner and found basically nothing, but then I walked over to the phone. I turned it over and got the serial number on it. Then I went back down to the lobby where my desk was, and I checked the security records for timestamps of calls that had been made from that room. Sure enough, there was a record of an active call having been made from this room to the front desk, the one that I had answered about 15 minutes ago. Obviously, the hotel didn't record the calls or anything, so all I was able to confirm was that someone was in that vacant room without permission. This ended up becoming a bigger investigation over the coming days. As the next morning, one of the guests staying in a room on that same floor was reported missing by a family member that was staying in a separate room. The security footage of all the entrances and exits was reviewed, and the missing person was last seen leaving the hotel alone a couple of hours prior to the call that I had received. It's still unclear if the two incidents were connected or not, but it's definitely a really strange situation. I don't know how the caller got access to that phone or who they were, but personally, I believe that the reason they called seemed to add up with someone getting forcefully kidnapped based on their brief description. The person behind the mystery call was never identified, and as of right now, the missing person still has not been found. During a road trip, I was passing through Ohio. It was around that time I was starting to get sleepy behind the wheel, so I stopped in a small town called Xenia. I looked for a hotel or motel and found this place called Xenia Country Inn. It looked a little run down, but so did this whole town, if I'm being honest. Plus, all I needed was a night's sleep, nothing fancy. So I parked in the lot and went to the little front office, which was in the front corner of one of the two buildings to the motel. There was an old man sitting there reading the paper. It was hot in there, and there was a loud buzzing sound from this tabletop fan. I asked for a room, and the man finally looked up from his paper without greeting me and said, $65. I assumed he meant $65 for the room, so I handed him my credit card. I asked if it was possible to get a corner room, and he simply said no. The customer service here was clearly not something included in the price. The man handed me this old-fashioned key on an otherwise blank key ring. They still didn't use key cards at this place. I walked across the parking lot to my room. The door was actually hard to unlock. I had to shimmy the key a little just to get it to finally turn. Before walking in, I looked around the lot. There were only 2 other cars in the parking lot. It was a ghost town. I stepped into the room, and it smelled like a mix of cotton and vomit. I wondered if I should go back and ask for a different room, but I realized by the look of this place, all the rooms probably smelled. The room was small and had a blue, dirty, worn-out-looking carpet, a couch, a small coffee table, and a bed. I shut the door and tried to lock it, but I was having trouble. More trouble than I did unlocking it. After about 30 seconds of shimmying and almost popping a blood vessel trying to unlock it, I felt I may have broken it. But when I tried opening the door, it wouldn't open. So even though the door wasn't fully locked, as long as the door wouldn't open, that's all that mattered, I figured. I crawled up in the bed, and I heard all the old springs squeaking as my weight pushed into the mattress and the bed frame. I tried putting on the TV, but of course the remote didn't work, so I just crawled under the covers and tried to go to sleep. Then it happened. I nearly jumped out of my own skin when there was one loud thump at the window. I looked at the guy standing outside of it, and he started talking, sounding all hurt and in need of help. He was saying, "Hey, please let me in. I hurt myself. I need help." And he definitely saw me in that bed. I yelled back to go to the front desk. He wouldn't stop, though. There was no way I was opening that door. I had a feeling he was acting, and this was a trap. Eventually, after ignoring him for long enough, he left. I turned to check and confirm, and he was gone. I hadn't realized how truly unsafe this area was. I had to get up and check the lock on the door just to be safe and make sure the door wouldn't open. I gave the door a couple of good pulls and it didn't open. I then closed the curtains in front of the two windows so that he couldn't come back and look in at me again. That shook me up a bit, but the nerves calmed within half an hour, and I was able to fall into a half sleep not too long after. I started having this weird dream where I was in a closed supermarket running from the manager who was chasing me, and at some point during the dream, these clicking sounds started taking over to the point that my whole dream shifted to incorporate these sounds. And then, with that, I was awake. The room was cold for some reason. Then I looked down and realized the blanket was pulled off of me. I sat up to pull it back over me, but then I saw at the foot of the bed, there was this tall figure looming over me. Before I could scream, he went, "Shh," and told me not to move. He told me he wouldn't hurt me if I didn't make any movements or sounds. Then he asked me where my wallet was. I told him it was in my jeans pocket on the floor. All I saw was this figure towering over me in the bed, moving away from the foot of the bed to my jeans on the floor. I heard him wrestling with the jeans, digging through the pocket until he found it. Then he asked what else I had in there. I was just taking a road trip. With that, he didn't say another word and left. I ran to try and relock the door as soon as he left, having the same trouble as earlier. I then called the police, but they were of no immediate assistance. We went to the guy at the front desk, who played back the video footage caught. However, the guy who entered the room was wearing a face mask and a hat, hiding all his features. I got my money back and left. Thank God I didn't have much cash in my wallet. I canceled all my cards and slept in my car. I learned my lesson never to stop at a sketchy motel. This happened to me during a business trip that I took last year for work. I arrived at the hotel and picked up my key to the room, which my company had paid for. It was a nice-looking hotel on the inside, though a bit smaller than most other hotels. There were maybe 30 to 40 rooms total, and only 3 stories. My room was on the top floor, so I took the elevator up and started making my way down the hallway. I put my bags down by the door and reached into my pocket for the room key. But just as I did that, the neighboring room's door opened, and a man stepped into the hall. He greeted me, mentioning that he was my neighbor, and held his hand out, gesturing for a handshake. I confusingly shook it and told him my name, then started making my way into the room. As I walked in, I noticed that he went back into his room as well and shut the door. I thought it was strange that someone would come out of their temporary hotel room just to greet me as their temporary neighbor. But some people are just like that, I guess. I unpacked my small suitcase and duffel bag, then laid on the bed and turned on the TV. It was pretty late already, and I was tired from the flight, so I planned on going to bed early that night. I took a quick shower, then turned off all the lights. I laid there trying to sleep for almost 20 minutes before hearing the neighbor's door creak open, followed by seeing their shadow walk by my door, but they stopped just before they passed my room. Through the sliver of light under the door, I could see their shadow get closer for a second before backing away and continuing down the hall. This obviously creeped me out, so I got up and made sure that all the locks were secured on the door, then went back to bed. The next day, I went to meet my coworkers at a company-owned building where we attended a presentation and had dinner. I didn't get back to the hotel until 10 p.m., and I was really exhausted. I tossed my work bag on the bed and then got in the shower. I was in there for maybe 10 minutes when, through the water splashing, I heard the distinct beep sound of the electronic door lock unlocking. I knew it was too late for it to be the cleaning services, so my mind instantly jumped to the strange man staying in the room next to mine, but I didn't know how he could possibly have a key card that could unlock my door. Not knowing what to do, I stood there silently as I listened to the door slowly open and then close, followed by footsteps walking past the bathroom door. With the shower running, I knew that they had to know that I was in there, which terrified me even more. I tried to quietly step out of the shower as to not alarm them. Then I quietly put on a pair of pants that I had lying on the ground. Making sure to lock it, I leaned my ear up against the bathroom door and listened. I could hear a faint noise sounding like someone was searching through one of my bags. Of course, I wanted to confront them, but for all I knew, They could have a gun or a knife. In the moment, I really just felt helpless and frozen in fear. I had no idea what this guy could want from me, but soon the room went silent. While I didn't have my phone with me, I figured my best bet was to call for help. At the very least, it would hopefully get the guy to run away. I took a deep breath, then started banging on the bathroom door, yelling for help as loud as I could. I could hear the man's frantic footsteps run past the door and back into the hallway. I quickly got out, closed the front door, locking it shut, then ran to the nightstand to get my phone and dialed 911 with my shaky hands. Once they were on their way, I called the front desk to let them know as well. Of course, by the time they got here, the man was already gone, but thankfully, the police found him in his car a few hours later. I'm not sure if he even got any jail time for his actions though, because they couldn't prove his motive to be harmful. I honestly think he was trying to kidnap me or something, though, as I don't know any other reason why he would go into the room when he knew that I was in there. But I guess we'll never know for sure what would have happened. Back when I was 18 and in my senior year of high school, I used to play softball for our school's female softball team. That year specifically, our school was actually really good, and because of that, we were invited to an invitational tournament in Las Vegas. I remember we stayed in a hotel only around 15 minutes from the city itself. It was around 9 p.m. when we got there, and we all sort of divided into our own groups to stay in hotel rooms. And because of that, me and 3 other close friends at the time decided to stay in a room together. Around an hour later, all 4 of us were unpacked and winding down in our room, as our first game of the tournament was scheduled early the next morning. But as I was lying in bed and basically half asleep at this point, the phone to our room rang. It kind of startled us, as I've stayed in many hotels before, and never once remember the hotel phone itself ringing. All of us, now wide awake, looked at each other. We agreed we should answer it and decided I would do it. So I picked up the phone and said the usual hello. Now this was a few years ago, so I don't remember the exact conversation. But on the other end of the phone, a man's almost whispering voice replied, saying we hadn't paid for a room and that one of us needed to come down to the lobby to pay for it. Immediately, red flags went off in my head, as I knew his claim wasn't true. I had witnessed our coach pay for the room not even 2 hours ago. Why would they have given us room keys if we hadn't paid for it? Plus, even if something had gone wrong with the payment, it would have been super unprofessional to call the room this late into the night. I replied to the man saying that we had paid for the room, but completely ignoring my statement, the man once again insisted that just one of us had to come down as our room wasn't paid for. His voice, now clearly frustrated, then followed the claim up with a threat, saying that if we didn't send one person down, there would be consequences. Now, I'm a pretty paranoid person, and the whole thing felt so wrong to me. There was no way I was letting any of us go down to the lobby. I replied to the man, saying that we would be staying in our room until someone came to escort us out, and hung up the phone. I figured that if that really was someone from the hotel, they would either come up to our room or just resolve the situation in the morning. I told the others that I got a really bad feeling from the dude and explained to them what happened. Thankfully, they all agreed that there was no chance we hadn't paid and that it was basically unheard of for a hotel front desk to call you in your room this late. Of course, we were all on edge but decided to forget about it and just go to sleep. No one came to kick us out, but through the night, the phone to the room did ring a few more times. The next morning, we told our coach about the situation, and he asked the person working at the front desk about it and if his payment for the room didn't go through. But to our horror, they had no idea what we were talking about and even insisted that the front desk would not have called us that late into the night. They agreed to check the security cameras to see if they could find anything, but for the rest of our time there, we never heard back from them. Luckily though, nothing else ever ended up happening to us. This whole situation was really disturbing and has left me with a lot of questions like, who called us? Why did they want one of us to exit the room alone in the middle of the night? And how did they know what room we were in? Honestly, the more I think about it, the more creeped out I get. But I'm just glad we decided to stay in our room that night. I was driving home from my friend's house. It was late. I don't know exactly the time, but if I had to guess, it was probably 2 or 3 a.m. I live 20 minutes away, which wasn't too far since most houses around here are spread out. The rain and lack of streetlights made it hard to see though, so I was driving slower and more carefully. 5 minutes down the road, I pulled up to a traffic light. I had the red light, but there was a blue car on the other side, partially in the intersection. Its headlights and everything were on, but it was just sitting there at a green light. I couldn't tell if there was something wrong or maybe they were asleep. But when the lights changed, I drove forward, slowly maneuvering around them. I tried to discreetly look in their car as I passed, but the rain on my window blocked most of my view. Only a moment after passing them and driving down the road again, the blue car turned and started following me, so it wasn't broken down after all. I kept my eye on the mirrors. I wouldn't consider myself a paranoid person, but the situation felt staged. Another minute down the road, the car's headlights started getting brighter in my mirrors as they pulled their car closer to what felt like just a couple of feet from my back bumper. In weather like this, that made me really uncomfortable. I looked back at the road but saw a small light pop up on my dashboard. It was a signal that one of my tires was low on air. A common signal, but it felt like an odd time for it to just pop up given the situation. I looked back in my mirrors, seeing the car still tailing me. They were so close their headlights almost made it hard to even see the actual car. I was just 4 or 5 minutes away from home, nearing the entrance to the neighborhood when my dashboard started flickering a new signal. Flat tire. My stomach dropped. The second I saw that signal, I put all the pieces together and was almost 100% sure that this car behind me had done something. I drove another minute, hoping to make it closer to home, but I could feel my car sinking to the left, and I was practically driving on the rims now. I had to pull over. The car behind me did the same. I should have called someone as soon as I parked, but I was so concerned and focused on what the person behind me was doing that it didn't even cross my mind. Though even if I did call someone, it probably wouldn't have prevented what happened next. Once parked, 3 doors opened from the car, and 3 men came out. I only had a few seconds to prepare and react, but I was helpless and defenseless. They ran up to my car, 2 on my side and 1 on the other. One of the men came right up to my window, yelling at me to open the door and pointing a gun at me. It happened so fast, I was just in some dazed state. I started to reach for the door, but the man by the back door smashed something against the window, shattering it, then reached his hand in and opened the back door. They were all still yelling, both at me and at each other. The man in the back reached across, opening the other back door, then reached in front of me to open my door. I was still just sitting there, holding my hands up now to show I wasn't a threat. I knew there was no way out of this, even if I did have a weapon. Once my door was opened, the man with the gun pulled me out of the car and slammed me on the ground. The oddest thing is, while I was on the ground looking out into the rainy pavement, all I was thinking about was how cold and wet the pavement was. Not about how I had a gun being pushed into the back of my head, or that I was being robbed and beaten. I think it was my head trying to distance myself from the traumatizing situation I was in. I wasn't on the ground for long before the men by the car called out, and the guy holding me down hit me in the back of the head, causing me to ricochet off the pavement. I wasn't even sure if he hit me with the gun or just his fist because I was already numb. I'm surprised it didn't knock me out though. I heard their car doors close and then driving away. I rolled over, still in a daze, and tried to pick myself up. They'd taken my phone, so I was forced to drive my car home and call the police when I got there, which ended up denting and damaging my rims anyway. The investigation went nowhere, determining only that the suspects had purposefully placed small tire spikes in the road at the intersection I crossed them at. I got lucky to have only hit 1 spike and fortunate to have caused less damage than usual. They likely planned to ambush me as soon as I hit the trap, but in the end, it didn't make a difference. I'm 24, and I lived alone with my dog Bear in a cozy townhome up until 3 months ago. I moved in when I turned 22, having a decent enough job. I loved the home, being the first place I'd ever rented for myself, but 2 years of happy living were ruined by this one night. It was gloomy outside and raining quite a lot. It was my day off, so I was sitting on a chair in my living room, scrolling on my phone. It was 8 p.m., which was just an hour before I usually went to bed. Bear had been sitting by the back door for a while looking outside. He started whining and ran up to me, which was his way of communicating that he needed to go outside. I got up and let him out, then closed the door and stood in the kitchen. While it was just a townhome, there was a small fence separating the backyards, so I didn't have to worry about Bear running away or anything. Also, I should mention that Bear isn't a large dog at all. He's just fluffy and small like a teddy bear. Not long, maybe 15 or 20 seconds. After I let him outside, I heard him whimper and bark. It was very clearly a cowering bark, like he was running away from something. That scared me, and I rushed to the door and looked out, seeing Bear running back toward me with his tail between his legs. Once he was inside, I leaned my head outside and scanned the backyard, expecting a coyote or something to be lurking by the fence. But nothing was there. I made sure Bear was okay and locked my door. He never does anything like that, so that made me really worried for him. I let him sit on my lap for the rest of the night. Through the next 30 minutes, he was constantly perking his head up and staring at the windows and doors, a different one each time. Then after 45 minutes of sitting there, Bear turned his head and stared at the window behind me, lowering his ears and growling. "Bear," I said, turning to look where he was looking. And right in the window, just a couple of feet from us, was a man staring back at me. He was almost right up against the glass. I jumped up and screamed, stepping backward. The man sprinted away down the side of the house. Bear started barking again from the sudden chaos. I closed the blinds and checked all of the others, making sure they were closed as well. From the quick glimpse I got, I didn't recognize the man. I didn't know who he was or what he was doing here or why he was staring at me. I tried to listen for any more indications that he was still around, but the rain outside was too loud, covering up any possible sounds. Bear seemed calmer though, so I stayed up for a while longer just to be safe, then went upstairs and had Bear sleep in my room with me. It took a long time for me to fall asleep, having a lot on my mind, but after an hour or so, I slowly dozed off. When I woke, Bear was standing upright by the bedroom door staring at it. This was a freaky thing to see, waking up in the middle of the night, but not even seconds later, I heard something below me, a man talking, and not long after, a man on the other side of the house talking back. Their footsteps were loud, and they didn't even seem to be whispering either. It was like they didn't care if I knew that they were inside my home. My bedroom door was locked, but I had nowhere else to go. I went over to Bear, quietly trying to keep him calm, then picked him up and went over to the corner of my room behind the bed. It took me a while to realize, but then it struck me that I hadn't heard any noises at all in the past minute. No steps or voices. This was when I took my phone out and called the police, whispering as softly as I could. As I told them my address, Bear started a low growl, then began barking and whining as two sets of footsteps started making their way up the stairs. I begged for the operator to send someone immediately. The two men started talking to each other again, but it was hard to make out their words. "Hey, we just want to talk. We're not here to hurt you." I screamed, saying I called the cops and for them to leave. I was panicking, not knowing what else to do. There was a pause afterward. "We're here to help you," one of the men said. I didn't respond as I was busy trying to muffle my crying. "Open the door." It got quiet again. I could only hear them breathing behind the door for what felt like a whole minute before one of them walked back down the stairs. I couldn't tell where they went downstairs or if they'd left or not, but I was sure that it was just one set of footsteps that left the bedroom door. It was so quiet though, and I couldn't hear any breathing. In the far distance, the soft sound of sirens started to get louder. A sense of safety was finally coming back. Once the sirens got closer, I heard footsteps running out of the house downstairs. But now I was unsure of where the other man was. It seemed really unlikely for him to be by my door still, but I could swear I'd never heard him leave. I waited for the police to pull up and make their way inside. I heard them searching downstairs, then slowly make their way upstairs and knock on my door. I almost didn't want to answer, still thinking that other man had to be somewhere nearby. When I opened the door though, it was just an officer. I immediately told him about my concerns. He directed me out of the house as one of his partners continued searching, but nobody was found. The only thing they were able to find was watery footprints all around the house, as well as an unlocked window, which, to be honest, I wasn't sure if I kept locked or not. It terrified me, though, feeling so confident that the other man was still there, never hearing him leave. But then there being no trace of him. It made it impossible to sleep at night, having this feeling of someone still in the house watching me. I moved out 3 months ago. It was too much stress on my mind, having a loose end like that, especially since neither of them were ever identified or arrested. There was no clear intention the men had either, which is just another question added to the list of uncertainty. Even now, living miles away in a new apartment, I still sometimes feel like I'm not alone.